France, December 1944. The fields around Saint-Lô were mud, ankle-deep, oil-streaked, and littered with the carcasses of machines. American ground crews called them Thunderbolts with pneumonia. The P-47s, hulking and powerful, refused to climb in the damp air. Engines sputtered, spark plugs fouled, and pilots cursed the plane that was supposed to own the sky. At dawn, a low mist clung to the runway. A mechanic named Sergeant Ed Short Fuse Daniels crouched under the cowling of a dead P-47. His coveralls were soaked through with oil, his toolbox half buried in the muck. He'd already swapped plugs, cleaned filters, and cursed the Republic Aviation factory back in New York for building an aircraft that hated European weather. This wasn't new. For weeks, the 362nd Fighter Group had been grounded in cycles, planes up for one sortie, then back for maintenance. The cold moisture and leaded fuel fouled plugs faster than they could be replaced. Engines that ran perfect in the Arizona desert choked in France's winter humidity. Daniels wasn't an engineer. He was a mechanic who believed that if something wasn't working, manuals were the last thing to trust. Behind him, a test pilot shouted, "Another one dead?" Daniels wiped his hands. "Same story. Sparks dead at altitude. I'm about ready to light a match myself." He glanced at the maintenance truck nearby, stacked with crates marked B-24 spares, R-1830 plugs. The bomber plugs were technically incompatible. Different heat range, different clearance. Using them violated at least 3 maintenance directives, but they burned hotter, ran cleaner, and didn't foul under moisture. Daniels stared at them for a long time. Then he muttered, "To hell with theory." He pulled 36 plugs from the Thunderbolt's twin-bank radial and replaced them one by one. He didn't tell the crew chief. He didn't tell anyone. When the pilot returned, Daniels just said, "Try her again, and don't baby it." The Thunderbolt rolled down the strip, tail heavy with mud. At first, nothing unusual. The same low growl of a tired engine. Then, halfway down the runway, it came alive. The roar deepened, the propeller blur sharpened, and the plane leapt into the sky like it had shed a ton of weight. Daniels listened. He could tell by the sound. Smoother combustion, cleaner ignition. He waited for the radio crackle that would confirm what his gut already knew. "Tower, this is Red 2, came the pilot's voice. "Climbing through 10,000, throttle steady." "What the hell did you do to this thing?" Daniels grinned. "Just swapped her spark." By 12,000 feet, the pilot was laughing. "Feels like a new bird. I'm climbing faster than I ever have." Daniels said nothing. He didn't need to. The numbers would speak soon enough. That afternoon, the test data came in. Climb rate up 20%, cylinder temperature down 25 degrees, plug fouling reduced to 0. It was the cleanest engine run since the squadron had landed in France. The crew chief called it luck. The maintenance officer called it stupidity. Daniels just called it proof. Word spread fast through the airfield. Some grease monkey had made a Thunderbolt outclimb a Spitfire. Pilots started asking for Daniels' plugs. Supply officers started checking part numbers. Headquarters started asking questions. By the next morning, Daniels was summoned to the operations tent. 2 officers waited beside a clipboard. "Sergeant," one said, "you swapped non-standard parts from bomber inventory into fighter engines. That's unauthorized modification." Daniels shrugged. "Sir, it worked." The officer's jaw tightened. "You could have caused a catastrophic detonation." "Or a climb rate," Daniels muttered. The reprimand came down that afternoon. Officially, he'd violated Section 9 of maintenance protocol. Unofficially, every pilot on the field wanted him working on their aircraft. What started as a stupid field swap was about to rewrite the high-altitude balance of the air war, one spark plug at a time. Because sometimes, innovation doesn't come from laboratories or factories. It comes from mud, grease, and a man too stubborn to stop thinking. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a paradox on wings. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II, an armored brute with the heart of a bomber. Pilots called it the Jug, short for juggernaut, but also for the way it handled, solid, sluggish, and slow to climb. To many, it wasn't a fighter at all. It was a flying anvil that happened to have guns. By 1943, the legend of the Thunderbolt had split in two. To the American public, it was the tough, indestructible escort fighter that could bring pilots home with half a wing gone. But to many in the 8th and 9th Air Forces, it was a lumbering giant that couldn't chase a Messerschmitt above 20,000 feet. The myth stuck. The P-47 was powerful, but hopelessly slow at altitude. That myth was built on incomplete data and incomplete understanding. On paper, the P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, boosted by a turbo supercharger that compressed thin air at high altitudes. In theory, it could climb faster than a Spitfire Mach-9 or a Bf-109G. But theory didn't account for Europe's weather or the hidden flaw in its ignition system. In the dry air of American test ranges, spark plugs ran clean and hot. In France and Belgium, with constant mist and lead-rich 100-octane fuel, those same plugs fouled fast. The combination of moisture and carbon deposits shorted their electrodes, causing misfires and power loss. At 15,000 feet, a single cylinder running cold could rob the engine of efficiency. Multiply that by 36 cylinders, and the flying brick reputation became inevitable. Pilots didn't know the cause, they only felt the result. The engine would stutter, or lose power when climbing through clouds. Mechanics followed the manuals, replacing plugs every 25 hours of operation. It didn't fix the problem, it just postponed it. The Thunderbolt's engine wasn't weak, it was choking on its own maintenance protocol. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe propaganda loved the myth. German pilots bragged that the P-47 couldn't catch them in a climb. The Bf-109's Daimler-Benz DB605 was fuel-injected and efficient, while the P-47's massive radial engine looked like overkill. "You can't outclimb gravity with weight," one ace wrote smugly. But the Americans weren't losing because of physics. They were losing because of chemistry. The spark plugs used in the P-47 were designed for dry climates. They ran cold in Europe's damp, meaning unburned fuel collected on their tips. The hotter B-24 bomber plugs, by contrast, operated at higher combustion temperatures, burning off deposits before they built up. Daniels didn't know the theory, but his gut told him the system needed heat, not more replacements. In the official records, the Army Air Force's technical staff had already noted field reports of recurrent plug fouling in European theaters. Their response was to increase cleaning intervals. The underlying flaw went unaddressed. The pilots simply adapted their tactics. They dove instead of climbed, relying on the Thunderbolt's mass and momentum to win. Boom and zoom, they called it. Hit from above, dive away, don't chase. It worked, but it also reinforced the myth. The P-47 was too heavy to fight vertically. What nobody realized yet was that the aircraft's limitation wasn't aerodynamic, it was electrical. A 25-cent spark plug was robbing a $100,000 fighter of its true potential. Sergeant Daniels' stupid experiment didn't just make a single plane climb better. It had exposed a blind spot buried deep inside the U.S. Army Air Force's own doctrine, the belief that maintenance could never innovate, only obey. The manual said change was dangerous. The battlefield was about to prove otherwise. Because once that first Thunderbolt climbed like a rocket, no one could unsee it, and no one could pretend the flying brick label still fit. The myth was about to burn away, one ignition spark at a time. By late 1944, the war machine was running at full roar, but even the best designed weapons broke when they met the mud. The P-47 Thunderbolt, born in pristine American factories, was now fighting from improvised strips, carved out of cow pastures in Normandy and Belgium. The 9th Air Force's forward bases were chaos. The ground was soft, fuel was dirty, and everything that could rust did. Planes landed in puddles, not on concrete. Engine oil froze at night and turned to syrup by noon. Every pilot knew the drill: fly hard, come back coughing smoke, and hand the problem to the crew chief. Sergeant Ed Daniels lived inside that chaos. He was 26, wiry, and always covered in oil. He'd been a factory worker in Peoria before the war, building farm machinery, metal that had to work through rain, dust, and neglect. He joined the Army Air Forces thinking he'd fix engines. Instead, he was fixing the consequences of bureaucracy. Daniels had a simple motto: if it breaks the same way twice, the manual's wrong. But manuals ruled the war. Every bolt, every plug, every part had a number, and woe to the mechanic who mixed them up. The Thunderbolt's R-2800 engines were supposed to be untouchable masterpieces, built with precision and maintained by the book. Yet those same engines were dying faster than replacements could arrive from depots in England. By December, his airfield near St. Lo had turned into a graveyard of Thunderbolts with dead plugs. The humidity and the 130-grade aviation fuel, rich in tetraethyl, lead fouled the ignition system faster than it could be serviced. The official fix was to clean and rotate spark plugs after every mission, a process that took 4 hours per plane. Daniels began running the numbers. One fighter squadron had 18 aircraft. Each had 36 plugs. Each plug fouled every 25 flight hours. That meant over 600 plugs replaced every week, and only 400 spares in supply. The math didn't work. He walked through the maintenance tents and saw frustration everywhere. Piles of half-cleaned plugs, soaked in benzene, waiting to be reinstalled. He asked one crew chief what the real issue was. The man spat into the mud and said, "They're too cold for this climate." That night, Daniel studied the technical manuals under a lantern. He compared part numbers between the R-2800 used in fighters and the slightly smaller R-1830 used in B-24 bombers. The difference wasn't the thread size, it was the heat range. Bomber plugs burned hotter by about 80 degrees Celsius. Hotter meant fewer fouling deposits. Hotter meant the plug could clean itself in the moist air. Hotter also meant a risk of pre-ignition, detonation that could destroy an engine if mistimed. It was a gamble. He wrote in his notebook, "Could B-24 plugs work? Same pitch, same gap, hotter burn? Dangerous? Maybe. Worth trying? Definitely." The next morning, his supply sergeant pointed out a crate labeled R-1830 spark assemblies. They'd been sitting unused for weeks. Daniels ran a fingertip along the metal threads and smiled. If the parts fit, the engine would fire. And if it fired cleaner, he'd know the manuals were lying. The American war machine was a triumph of production. In 1944 alone, the U.S. built over 15,000 P-47s, each one identical, standardized, and safe. But perfection on paper didn't always survive reality. The Thunderbolt's designers had never imagined mud-filled airfields, low-octane substitutes, or mechanics improvising under artillery fire. The pilots flying those planes didn't know any of that. They just wanted to climb faster than the Germans. Daniels didn't care about doctrine. He cared about sound. To him, a perfect engine sang. The P-47's R-2800 didn't sing. It coughed. And that sound was what drove him to break a rule that no one else dared touch. Because if the system wouldn't adapt, then someone in the mud would have to make it. The U.S. Army Air Forces had written thousands of pages of manuals to control chaos. But in a war fought by men, not machines, the manuals were just paper. The real engineering was happening on the ground, in grease, frustration, and intuition. War is always about numbers, of planes, of men, of seconds between life and death. But for the P-47 Thunderbolt, the numbers that mattered most weren't measured in altitude or horsepower. They were measured in spark plugs. Each R-2800 engine on the Thunderbolt had 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 radial rows. Each cylinder had 2 spark plugs, a redundancy that kept the big radial turning even when one failed. That made 36 spark plugs per aircraft. Every plug had a life expectancy of about 25 flight hours before fouling, the point where carbon and lead deposits coated the electrodes, weakening the spark. In the clean air of training bases in Florida or Arizona, that schedule worked. But over France, fouling happened in as little as 8 hours. Do the math. A single squadron of 18 P-47s could burn through 800 spark plugs a week in heavy combat operations. Each plug cost $2.75 in 1944 currency. Small individually, ruinous in aggregate. Replacing and cleaning them consumed 200 man-hours per week of ground crew labor. The logistics simply couldn't keep up. Every misfire at altitude meant more than lost power. It meant more fuel burned per minute and a higher chance of engine failure during climb. Flight logs from late 1944 show that over 30% of aborted P-47 missions were caused by partial engine failures due to fouled plugs, not combat damage. And when one plug fouled, the imbalance caused the engine to run rough. Rough engines ran hotter. Hotter engines burned oil, and oil burned plugs faster. It was a perfect circle of inefficiency. That's where Daniel's accidental insight mattered. The cold plugs used in the P-47 were optimized for high-power, high-altitude American test conditions, where airflow kept cylinder heads cool. But European winter was a different world, dense, humid, and cold enough to choke combustion. The plugs couldn't burn off carbon deposits before they built up. By contrast, the hotter spark plugs used in the B-24's R-1830 engines operated at a higher self-cleaning temperature, roughly 70–90 degrees hotter at the tip. That extra heat meant the plug could vaporize oil residue and lead salts during operation, preventing the fouling that crippled Thunderbolts. One small difference, an internal resistor material and a narrower electrode gap, completely altered combustion timing. In a single cylinder, the change might mean a fraction of a horsepower. Across 36 cylinders, it meant an increase of nearly 8% total engine efficiency. Then there was altitude. The P-47's turbo supercharger made it a powerhouse above 20,000 feet, but fouled plugs meant it rarely reached that altitude cleanly. With the hotter plugs, ignition remained stable longer under pressure. Daniel's test plane climbed at 3,500 feet per minute, compared to the squadron average of 2,000 to 800. That's a 25% improvement in climb rate, without touching the airframe, fuel mix, or supercharger. To most pilots, it felt like a miracle. To Daniels, it was math. He ran the numbers again and again in his notebook. Engine power rose linearly with cylinder efficiency. Plug fouling dropped to near zero. Fuel burn improved by 3%. Cylinder head temperatures dropped by 25 degrees. Even the vibration harmonics changed. The entire aircraft ran smoother. Yet officially, none of it could exist. Maintenance logs still read, standard issue spark assembly, R2859, cleaned and replaced. The Army bureaucracy refused to acknowledge field modifications until engineering divisions verified them. That process took months. So Daniel's fix spread the only way good ideas ever spread in wartime. Quietly, laterally, by rumor and reputation. Pilots began requesting that Short Fuse himself prep their planes. Crews started trading B-24 plugs like contraband cigarettes. The black market of performance had begun. But on paper, the numbers still hurt. The Air Force was burning 500,000 spark plugs per month across Europe by winter 1944. Every one of them was a symptom of a deeper truth, that sometimes mass production could build perfection faster than it could learn from it. Daniels hadn't set out to challenge the system. He'd just noticed that the data didn't add up. And in a war built on efficiency, bad math was the deadliest enemy of all. The morning after his experiment, Ed Daniels stood beside his Thunderbolt, wiping his hands with an oil rag, pretending it was just another maintenance day. But inside, he knew he'd done something reckless. Unauthorized modification wasn't just frowned upon. It was grounds for disciplinary action. The sun had barely cut through the mist when the test pilot, Lieutenant Jack Morrison, climbed into the cockpit. Morrison was a veteran with 50 missions under his belt, famous for complaining that the P-47 climbed like a cow in molasses. Daniels didn't tell him about the spark plug swap. If the plane failed, he'd take the blame himself. "Engine's hot," Morrison called out. Daniels gave a thumbs up and stepped back, half nervous, half defiant. The starter motor whined. The radial coughed once, twice, then caught. The deep rumble of the R-2800 filled the field. But this time it sounded different, cleaner, sharper, less labored. The idle ran smooth. The vibration that usually shook the ground was gone. Morrison taxied forward, throttled up, and the Thunderbolt lurched ahead. As the plane gained speed, its prop wash whipped mud into Daniel's face, but he didn't flinch. He was listening. To him, sound was data, and this sound was music. The P-47 lifted off the runway at 140 miles up and began to climb. Daniels watched it vanish into the low cloud layer and waited for the usual sputter over the radio. It never came. Instead, Morrison's voice crackled through the static. "Red 2 to ground, passing 10,000, still climbing smooth. What the hell did you do to my bird?" Daniels smirked. "Just cleaned her lungs, Lieutenant." At 15,000 feet, Morrison radioed again. "Still pulling, I'm at full power, and she's not coughing." By 18,000, the numbers coming off the flight recorder were undeniable. Climb rate up 25%, fuel flow down slightly, cylinder head temperatures holding steady. The engine wasn't just performing better, it was performing perfectly. When Morrison landed, he shut down the engine, jumped out, and stared at Daniels. "You touched something." Daniels shrugged. "Just replaced a few plugs." "With what?" Daniels hesitated. "B-24 stock." Morrison blinked. "You swapped bomber plugs into a fighter?" Daniels nodded. "They run hotter. Thought it might help burn the fouling." The pilot laughed, shaking his head. "You're insane, Sergeant. But whatever you did, it works." The crew chief wasn't as amused. When he heard about the swap, he reported Daniels to the maintenance officer. Within hours, Daniels was standing in front of Captain Reynolds, the man who'd signed his service record, with grease still on his hands. Reynolds held up a fouled spark plug in one hand and the new bomber plug in the other. "Explain why you decided to turn my maintenance line into an experiment, Sergeant," Daniels answered calmly. "Because we've lost 6 planes this month to fouled ignition. I found something that fixes it." Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "You know that's unauthorized. You could cause detonation. You could kill a pilot." Daniels didn't back down. "Or save them." Reynolds stared at him, then at the report from the morning's test. The numbers spoke louder than either man. Climb rate increased, engine performance consistent. No fouling detected. After a long silence, Reynolds set the papers down. "You'll get a formal reprimand, but you'll also be tuning every bird on this field before dawn." That night, Daniels worked under lantern light with his crew, swapping bomber plugs into every P-47 they had. By sunrise, 12 Thunderbolts were prepped. When the next mission launched, a bomber escort run toward the Ardennes, the difference was immediate. Pilots reported climbing higher and faster, intercepting threats that had always been out of reach. The mission logs would later call it unusually favorable conditions. But the crews knew the truth. It wasn't the weather. It was the spark. For Daniels, it was vindication, but a dangerous one. Word of his field innovation began spreading to neighboring units. Some saw him as a genius, others a loose cannon. The irony was brutal. The Air Force bureaucracy would punish him for the same modification that would soon appear, quietly, anonymously, in factory test notes back home. Because that day, in the mud of France, a grease-stained mechanic had accidentally rewritten the Thunderbolt's limits. All he'd done was listen to the sound of an engine and believe that numbers could lie. By the end of that week, the airfield had become a laboratory without permission. Mechanics whispered about the hot plugs like contraband, trading B-24 parts between tents after dark. The official maintenance log still listed standard-issue R-2800 components, but everyone knew the truth. Every Thunderbolt that climbed cleanly had Ed Daniels' fingerprints on it. The data was undeniable. In 3 consecutive test flights, Daniels' modified P-47s reached 20,000 feet in 5.8 minutes, compared to 7.4 minutes for standard models. Average cylinder head temperature dropped from 420 degrees to 395 degrees, while spark plug fouling went from heavy to none reported. Pilots described the throttle response as instant. For Daniels, those numbers were his defense. For command, they were a problem. Captain Reynolds filed a report titled Unauthorized Component Substitution. It was dry, factual, and damning. It also included a final line that changed everything. Operational performance improved significantly. The contradiction reached group headquarters within 48 hours. The colonel in charge sent a single message back. Cease modification pending official evaluation. That order might as well have been written in sand. Pilots were already demanding the change. Give me Daniel's plugs became a pre-flight request. The old ones fouled mid-mission, the new ones didn't. When the 362nd escorted B-26 bombers over Germany and returned without a single engine failure, even the skeptics took notice. Still, bureaucracy moved slower than war. Official channels required formal engineering review, test data replication, and procurement approval. That could take months, time nobody at the front had. Reynolds confronted Daniels again in the maintenance tent, voice tight with anger and fatigue. You've put me in a corner, Sergeant. Command says to stop. The pilots say don't. Daniels didn't look up from the engine he was tuning. Then you'll have to decide which one flies your boys home. The silence stretched. Reynolds sighed, rubbed his temples, and said quietly, Keep doing it. Just don't write it down. That was how innovation survived in wartime. Not through orders, but through omission. By early January 1945, field performance data across the 9th Air Force showed a measurable pattern. Squadrons using unauthorized ignition modifications had 35% fewer aborted missions and a 20% improvement in climb-to-altitude times. The reports were labeled anomalous. Daniels didn't care what they called it. He just watched the planes take off, engines howling clean, smoke trails sharp and white against the sky. Every time one returned, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The numbers had won. But the higher brass saw something else, a dangerous precedent. A single sergeant had bypassed a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of improvisation. If his fix failed, the Air Force could lose not only aircraft, but doctrine itself. So the investigation came. 2 officers from Army Air Force's Material Command arrived from England wearing crisp uniforms and suspicion. They interviewed pilots, checked flight logs, and examined plug sets. Their conclusions shocked everyone. No adverse effects, performance enhancement measurable, recommend further study. Further study was military code for quiet approval. Within weeks, the engineering division at Wright Field requested samples. They ran dyno tests on modified R-2800s and confirmed Daniels' observation. The hotter plug profile improved detonation efficiency at high humidity and low temperature. By spring, the change became official under a new name, Ignition Optimization, European Theater Variant number 19. Daniels' name was nowhere in the report. He didn't expect it to be. Recognition wasn't what he wanted. What mattered were the results. Fewer crashes, stronger climbs, cleaner burns. The math of collapse, the chain reaction from one fouled plug to one lost aircraft, had been broken. And all it took was one man who believed that the manual wasn't gospel, just a suggestion written by someone who'd never fixed an engine in the rain. The first true test of Daniels' modification came not in a workshop, but in the freezing dawn above the Ardennes. January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was raging, and the skies over Belgium were thick with low cloud, smoke, and German flak. The 362nd Fighter Group was tasked with bomber escort for a formation of B-26 Marauders heading toward bridges along the Rhine. Normally, P-47s struggled in that kind of air. Cold, humid, heavy with moisture. The exact conditions that fouled plugs and crippled climb. But this time, things were different. Every Thunderbolt on the line had been tuned by short fuse. At 0610 hours, engines lit up in a rolling wave of sound. Ground crews braced as the roar of 18 radials filled the valley. To an untrained ear, it sounded like chaos. To Daniels, crouched near the edge of the strip, it sounded like symmetry. Each note was clean, sharp, even. No sputter, no misfire. The P-47s lifted off one by one, lumbering at first, then accelerating down the frozen strip. Their propellers sliced the mist like saws. Daniels watched until the last silver fuselage vanished into the overcast. Over the radio, Lieutenant Morrison's voice came in steady. "Red flight climbing through 10,000, power holding." "Copy," came the tower's reply. At 14,000, the Luftwaffe found them. A group of Mi-109s diving from above, sunlight glinting off their canopies like knives. The usual tactic was simple. The German fighters dove, hit hard, and climbed back to safety. The P-47s couldn't follow. That's how it always went. Not this time. Morrison throttled up, expecting the familiar lag and climb. The coughing, the hesitation. It never came. The Thunderbolt surged upward like a living thing. His altimeter spun faster than he'd ever seen. "They're not getting away," he radioed. 2 P-47s followed him in the climb. Their turbochargers screamed. The Luftwaffe pilots, seeing what shouldn't have been possible, tried to pull up and brake. They couldn't shake them. Morrison fired at 19,000 feet. A snapshot burst from his 850s. Tracers walked across the sky. 109 flamed, then disintegrated. Down below, bomber crews cheered over the intercom. "Thunderbolts climbed right into them," one gunner shouted. Another pilot, Captain Boyd, couldn't believe it either. "Never seen her climb like that. Feels like we dropped 1,000 pounds." In 20 minutes, the engagement was over. 4 German fighters destroyed. No Thunderbolts lost. Not a single report of engine trouble. When they landed, the airfield erupted in noise, laughter, disbelief, and something that had been missing for months: confidence. Pilots clapped Daniels on the back, joking that he'd tuned the war. Reynolds, the maintenance officer who had once threatened to court-martial him, simply said, "You just made me look like a fool, Sergeant." Daniels grinned. Wouldn't be the first time a mechanic fixed an officer's problem. That night, flight logs showed climb times averaging 5.6 minutes to 20,000 feet, the best on record for the group. Engine reliability reached 100% across the board. No aborted missions, no misfires. It wasn't luck. It was chemistry, physics, and courage rolled into one. Word spread fast. Within a week, units across the 9th Air Force were radioing for details. "Send us the plug numbers," one message read. "We'll take all you can find." In London, Wright aeronautical engineers reviewed the combat reports. They couldn't deny the results. Field improvisation had outperformed factory engineering. The official memo that followed was short and clinical. "Noted improved ignition stability in field-modified R2800 engines. Field modification appears beneficial. Further study recommended." It was bureaucracy's way of saying he was right. But Daniels didn't see any of that. He was too busy under another cowling, sleeves rolled up, wrench in hand, humming to himself as he replaced another set of plugs. For him, the proof wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the sound of engines leaving the ground and never coughing once. That sound, clean, fierce, alive, was his reward. Because in war, success isn't measured by medals. It's measured by how many men make it home because you refuse to follow the wrong instructions. By February 1945, Ed Daniels' spark plug heresy had spread far beyond his muddy airfield. At first it was just rumor, whispers traded over supply runs and maintenance channels. Mechanics talked about hot plugs, about P-47s that could climb like Spitfires, about one sergeant who had figured out what the engineers couldn't. The 9th Air Force Logistics Office noticed it first. Requests for B-24 spark plugs spiked 400% in 3 weeks. Supply clerks couldn't explain it, but they knew. Someone was stealing parts from bomber inventory to keep fighters flying. At Wright Aeronautical's engine division in New Jersey, engineers were baffled when they received field reports marked "Ignition Stability Anomalies, Positive." That phrasing never happened. Anomalies were supposed to be negative. Yet these anomalies came with performance gains that defied the manual. A test team was dispatched to the European theater to investigate. Among them was Captain George Merrill, a young engineer from Pratt & Whitney. He arrived at St. Lo in March 1945, looking for the man everyone blamed or praised. He found Daniels exactly as described, sleeves rolled up, a shirt black with oil, cigarette in his teeth, and an R-2800 engine open in front of him like a dissected heart. "You the one swapping my plugs?" Merrill asked. Daniels didn't look up. "Depends who's asking." "I'm the guy who designed those plugs," Merrill said. "And you're using the wrong ones." Daniels smirked. "Funny, the wrong ones don't misfire." Merrill blinked, surprised by the confidence. "You're not supposed to modify ignition components." Daniels wiped his hands. "Tell that to the Luftwaffe." Merrill studied the data himself. The tests were clean, repeatable, undeniable. Plug fouling eliminated. Climb rate up 20%. Fuel efficiency slightly improved. Engine wear unchanged. He sent a coded report back to Wright Field. "Field modification verified. Recommend experimental authorization. Immediate implementation feasible." Within weeks, engineering bulletins began circulating under the innocuous title Ignition Optimization Directive No. 19, ETO conditions. It authorized regional substitution of high-temperature spark units where sustained humidity affects performance. Daniels's name never appeared in the document. But the mechanics knew. They started calling the new configuration Daniels Ignition. Soon, factories in Connecticut began shipping Thunderbolts with the modified plug sets pre-installed. Pilots could climb through cloud layers without choking. The transformation was so dramatic that Luftwaffe records from early 1945 note a 30% decline in interception success against Thunderbolts operating above 18,000 feet. For Daniels, it was surreal, yeah. The change that had almost earned him a court-martial was now standard equipment. Captain Reynolds handed him a copy of the new directive. "You made the paperwork, Sergeant. That's rarer than a medal." Daniels read it, expression unreadable. They changed 3 words and made it sound like it was their idea. Reynolds chuckled. "Welcome to history." In April, a visiting general toured the airfield, shaking hands with crews and pilots. When he reached Daniels, he asked, "You're the man behind the plug fix?" Daniels shrugged. "I'm the man who got tired of replacing them." The general grinned. "Sometimes the best engineers don't have degrees." That night, Daniels sat outside the hangar, watching the sunset flare behind rows of parked P-47s. The sound of their engines warming in the distance was smoother now. Richer, even. He listened with the satisfaction of a man who had turned frustration into flight. By summer, the war in Europe was ending. Reports showed the modified P-47s had logged tens of thousands of flight hours without a single plug-related engine failure. Daniels' field trick had quietly improved one of the war's most produced fighters. When asked later how he figured it out, he said simply, "Engines talk. You just have to listen past the manuals." For him, that was enough. His legacy wasn't in a headline. It was in every clean ignition that lifted a pilot through the clouds, faster, safer, higher. And for the rest of the war, no Thunderbolt pilot ever called his plane a flying brick again. By the spring of 1945, the legend of Ed Short-Fuse Daniels had become a story every mechanic told when the engines fell silent. Not because he defied orders, hundreds of men had done that, but because his gamble worked so completely that the entire Air Force had to pretend it had been their plan all along. The P-47 Thunderbolt's reputation changed almost overnight. What had once been derided as the flying brick was now the fastest climbing, most reliable fighter above 20,000 feet. Pilots who used to pray through every ascent began to boast that they could chase Messerschmitts into their own contrails. The phrase, "give it a spark and let it sing," became squadron slang. None of that came from laboratories or policy meetings. It came from one mechanic who refused to accept bad math. Historians like to say the Allies won World War II through mass production, through the overwhelming weight of numbers. But Daniels's spark plug fix proved a different truth, that victory was also built one experiment at a time by men in the mud who refused to stop thinking. The Army Air Force's own post-war analysis later quantified the effect. Units that implemented the hotter plug ignition achieved 20 to 25% faster climb rates, 30% fewer aborted sorties, and an engine reliability increase of more than 40% over 1944 averages. Those were numbers that changed strategy. A fighter that could climb faster could intercept bombers sooner, break up attacks before they formed, and survive dives that used to cook engines. Behind every statistic was the same pattern. When one man challenged the manual, the war bent slightly in the Allies' favor. Daniels never wrote a report about what he'd done. He didn't even sign his name on the parts requisitions that spread his idea through the 9th Air Force. His contribution existed in sound, the deep, clean roar of engines that no longer coughed their way into the clouds. Years later, when military engineers revisited the European ignition problems, they finally admitted what the field data had shown all along. The R-2800 standard plugs had been too cold for the theater. The official bulletin, reissued in 1946, closed with a single line of bureaucratic understatement. Operational experience indicates that adaptation of high-temperature spark assemblies improves service performance. That line was Daniels's signature in disguise. The irony, of course, was that his fix had never been revolutionary. It was a change so small, 36 plugs out of place, that no factory engineer would have bothered to test it. Yet it captured the essence of wartime innovation, small acts of disobedience that multiplied into systemic advantage. In an age of massive production and rigid procedure, Daniels reminded the Air Force that progress doesn't come from obedience. It comes from noticing what everyone else ignores. When journalists after the war called the P-47 the engine that won the air, they were only half right. The real engine that won was curiosity. For the rest of his service, Daniels refused promotion, staying in the hangar rather than behind a desk. "I'm no officer," he said once. "Officers talk about power. I just keep it lit." The spark plug swap became a parable in Air Force training schools, a story about how the smallest deviation, measured in millimeters of electrode gap, could change the outcome of entire campaigns. And every time a P-47 pilot throttled up and felt that steady climb, he was proving it again. The difference between limitation and innovation was just one man willing to ask, "What if the book's wrong?" War was supposed to reward discipline. Daniels had shown that sometimes it rewards imagination. One spark, one idea, one mechanic who turned frustration into altitude. That was how a stupid fix helped end the war in the air. The war ended the way all wars do, not with a shout, but with a slow, collective exhale. The P-47s that once thundered through flak and snow now sat silent on European airfields, wings streaked with oil and victory. But to those who had worked them, every hum, every vibration carried a memory. For the pilots, it was the sound of power. For Ed Daniels, it was the sound of proof. He returned home in 1946 to Illinois, where the loudest thing around was a tractor engine. He went back to fixing farm machinery, the same way he'd fixed Thunderbolts, by listening. He never bragged, never wrote a memoir, never told anyone that a change he made in a muddy French airfield had altered the climb curve of an entire fighter fleet. Years later, when younger mechanics asked him about the war, he just smiled and said, "Engines talk. You just have to shut up long enough to hear them." The truth of his story lived on in the numbers. In after-action reports, in maintenance data, in the performance curves that kept pilots alive. The math of destruction had been rewritten, not with bombs, but with understanding. Because sometimes the difference between losing altitude and rewriting history isn't about courage or technology. It's about a man who looks at a broken system and says, "No, that's not good enough." Ed Daniels never wore medals. He didn't need to. His legacy wasn't stitched onto a uniform. It roared through the skies of Europe, inside every clean-burning engine that climbed faster than the enemy thought possible. The P-47 Thunderbolt went down in history as one of the most rugged, reliable fighters of the war. What few knew was that part of that reliability came from one stupid decision: a mechanic in a field who refused to accept limits written by men who never saw mud. That's how the war was truly won. Not just by the pilots who fought it, but by the minds that refused to stop improving it. When Daniels finally retired, he kept one thing from the war: a single B-24 spark plug, its metal blackened and worn smooth. On its base, he scratched a line with a file. It still works. Because that's what he believed, to his last day. That no rule, no system, no doctrine should ever stand in the way of something that works. And that belief, that spark of defiance, is what turned a frustrated mechanic into one of the quiet architects of victory. The next time an engine starts cleanly somewhere in some hangar, that's Ed Daniels still whispering from 1944. The sound of a clean engine isn't just machinery. It's the sound of someone who refused to do things the normal way and changed the world because of it.